Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss a report titled An Incomplete Project, Australians' Views of the US Alliance. This report was authored by Professors Caitlin Byrne, Peter Dean, Stephan Frühling, and Andrew O'Neill. We're joined here today to discuss this report, which was funded by the Department of Defence by Caitlin, Andrew, and Stephan. And we're so excited to have them here today as we discuss the key themes and findings of this report and tease out what some of those findings are. So perhaps I could start by asking the question about what this project was based on. There's a lot of conversation in the report about a time and era of strategic change, Australia navigating strategic challenges. And perhaps it'd be a great place for us to start by asking, well, what is that landscape? What is this backdrop that this report was based on? Perhaps, Caitlin, I can turn to you for that.
Thanks so much, Scott, and really good to be with you. I guess, as you say, the report was really developed against this backdrop of strategic uncertainty. In really broad terms, that's a dynamic that we've seen evolve over time. It's something that's been referenced in defence white papers since the 2009 Defence White Paper and foreshadowed over the past decade, but possibly most explicitly talked about in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, which really does note that Australia's region is in the midst of the most consequential strategic realignment since the Second World War. And there are a number of drivers that have really been identified as being associated with that strategic realignment, most notably the rise of a more assertive China and the strategic competition that has emerged between China and the United States. And there are a whole lot of other factors that play into this landscape of uncertainty and volatility. I think the other point for us through a more specific lens was the fact that in September 2021, the US Biden administration, together with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and also Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, announced that the launch of the AUKUS Pact that would ultimately help Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines and other technologies. This kind of announcement seemed to be, a really new feature in the landscape, and particularly the landscape of the alliance. So I think all of these things together really made us interested in how were Australians thinking about the alliance against the backdrop of this really different landscape.
Excellent. And to consider then that backdrop and how to answer that question, what should Australians expect to leverage from the US alliance? How did you go about answering that question? Was there a particular research methodology that you used to underpin the findings to perhaps find something new or distinct? Perhaps, Andrew, I can turn to you there to speak to some of the methodology questions.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So we were very much aware of the high quality of a lot of the quantitative polling that has been done by obviously the Lowy Institute, but also by the United States Studies Centre and some of the Australian Electoral Survey data that has been collected as well. And so I guess where we wanted to make our sort of difference in the field was establish our difference in the field was that we wanted to sort of drill down. So that polling is largely essentially quantitative polling, which has a lot of breadth in terms of reaching a very large audience. It's based on a kind of Likert scale methodology where people are asked a question and give their response to a 4 or 5 point sort of across a 4 or 5 point spectrum. We didn't take that approach. Instead, what we did was engage in a period of consultation over six months, where we spoke to people and really drilled down and essentially traded off breadth for depth. And that's what we were really interested in, digging down into some of the themes that were prevalent in the quantitative polling, but by definition can't be explored in quantitative polling. We really wanted to sort of drill down into a lot of those and ask some deeper questions about people's views on the alliance.
Can I just also jump in on that point as well, because I think it goes back to that landscape issue. We know against the backdrop, this really strategically uncertain backdrop, that the Australia-US alliance is an integral part of Australia's defence and foreign policy. But, you know, we haven't really spent much time talking about how Australia uses the alliance to navigate that landscape, and less talking to Australians in the broad public about what they think about this. So I think, you know, it really was kind of getting that depth, as Andrew has mentioned, but thinking really differently as well about how we engage in a conversation with Australians about the role the alliance plays and how Australia might actually think about leveraging that alliance going forward in this really different environment.
And on that basis, we conducted several workshops and consultations, both online and around the country. And again, I think on behalf of the research team, we'd like to thank everyone who joined us for those consultations. It was an invaluable process. But from there, obviously, we drew out some really interesting findings in the report, and some, of course, consistent with polling and current discourse around the Australia-US alliance. And perhaps, Stephan, I could turn to you to speak to some of those findings, those core findings that came out of that consultation process.
Yes, thank you. Now, some of the main themes that we do know from the quantitative polling of recent years is that there has been a significant increase in threat perception amongst Australians. Since about 2014, Australians feel a lot less safe in general and about the security of Australia in the international environment. Since 2018, views of China have changed significantly, to a large number of Australians now seeing China as a potential threat to Australia. But what we haven't really seen is similar trend lines necessarily in relation to the US alliance. So support for the alliance in terms of how many people believe that the alliance is very or fairly important to Australia is at a high, but it's kind of like returned back to what it was, for example, during the Obama administration. And we see 77% in the Lowy poll of respondents agreeing with the statement that Australia's alliance with the US makes it more likely that Australia will be drawn into a war that's not in Australia's interests. And also support for American forces operating from Australia hasn't increased in any way near the same level to which these other shifts in public opinion. So in many ways, what our project did was kind of to some extent confirm the broad outlines of this. We did also find very strong support for the alliance across the Australian population. I mean, we have had our own methodology of grouping people and classifying people's views. And in our view, I mean, in our findings, we have about 2/3 that we found were strong or full supporters of the alliance, which is consistent with the quantitative polling, and I think a good result given the different validation of our methodology. But I think what our methodology has allowed us to do is drill a bit deeper into uncovering some of those oddities or things that these polling couldn't explain. And so what we have found, for example, is, and it was a major finding, is a significant concern about sovereignty amongst the Australian population. So amongst the people that were very supportive and ultimately believed that the alliance is unequivocally positive for Australian security, we find that about half of them also have significant concerns, though, about what it means for Australian sovereignty, about the ability for Australia to make decisions that are in its own interest, about what it might mean for our ability to take independent positions on policy questions. Often these concerns are not well articulated. They're more of a gut feeling than actually something that people can articulate in regards to specific issues. But it is a significant attitude that Australians and concern that Australians have about the alliance that I think explains some of those differences in the quantitative polling. Another kind of major finding that we had is that whether you are a supporter or more skeptical or even an opponent of the alliance, almost all Australians share a very transactional approach to the alliance. So they approach it through a cost-benefit calculation. In many ways, supporters see the alliance as something that helps Australian security at relatively little cost, opponents see a much greater cost to Australian security and sovereignty that is not worth the benefit. But ultimately, it is a transactional cost-benefit approach that was a common theme cutting across different viewpoints of the alliance. And I think that's an interesting result, given the emphasis that is sometimes also placed on shared values with the United States, or a sense of shared community, for example, that one might say animates alliances in other parts of the world, and doesn't seem to resonate in quite the same way here in the Australian population. And I think related to that is enduring underlying concerns about Trump, but ultimately also about broader concerns about what Trump means about the domestic direction of the United States. A concern that, I mean, is the US still going to be the US long-term that we were used to in the past? That just, again, induces a sense of caution, I think, in amongst the Australian population, which again is something that is not necessarily correlated with opponents or proponents of the alliance, but again, it explains a certain sense of reserved support or reservation about not necessarily the positive aspects of the alliance, but how much we can actually rely and should rely on the alliance as such.
And you're speaking here, of course, about findings that we're able to really tease out because of the qualitative approach, finding things, of course, that are consistent, but even there's some themes that may be quite distinct or in some ways quite surprising. Perhaps we could speak to some of those findings as well, which may have surprised you a bit. It provided some distinction from some of the other conversations that we usually see on the alliance. Andrew, perhaps I could turn to you to speak to some of those findings.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think one of the most surprising, but the most basic finding was I think the different categories of views around the alliance. So we had really 4 categories that we discovered through our research, and that was full supporters of the alliance, largely, if not completely, unqualified support, reserve support for the alliance. Skeptical, not opposing, but not fully supporting, and then finally opponents of the alliance. So while the majority of respondents we kind of spoke to were supportive of the alliance, almost all of the people we spoke to noted that there were flaws in the alliance that needed to be addressed. And I guess sort of pivoting off that sort of general observation, 3 more specific observations would be that no matter where you lie on that 4, that sort of those 4 views, those 4 categories of views of the alliance, there was a belief among respondents that Australia needs to be much more cognizant of the regional impact and implications of the alliance. And for example, this came through in some of the conversation about AUKUS that Caitlin sort of flagged a little earlier in the discussion, is that the sense that it's sort of blindsided the region, and that's not a good thing, because Australia obviously has a very significant stake in regional relationships, but also that Australia perhaps needs to be leveraging its high-level contacts in Washington much more effectively in prosecuting its interests in the region. So that was an interesting observation. Another one was around the view, again, largely across the spectrum, no matter what your views of the alliance were, the view that Australia needs to do a much better job of exploring, putting initiatives on the table, how we can broaden the base of the alliance to non-defence issues, including climate change, which was the big one, but also economic issues, business engagement, and sort of broadening out the 2+2 dialogue between the United States and Australia, and that's in Australia's interests. And just to sort of circle back to a point that Stephan was talking about just before around values, I think what was interesting was a very kind of explicit view among many of the respondents that actually Australia and the US have quite foreign domestic cultures, in the sense that, if we take issues like reproductive health and gun control, just to take 2 of the most prominent, many Australians find that quite a foreign culture. So although there is a narrative, there is a discourse around shared values, at the elite level between Washington and Canberra, I think when you drill down into the views of the Australian population, there's less enthusiasm and in some quarters quite marked skepticism towards the values kind of proposition, if I could put it like that.
And these findings obviously tease out some really interesting recommendations then. We take those findings and say, well, knowing this, and this is the discourse from the Australian public, how should Australia leverage the US alliance? So let's speak for a few minutes about those recommendations. And I can start with you, Stephan. What did the report then recommend based on the conversations and desires of the Australian public?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think the first recommendation that we made is that there is a need for the government, we think, to define what the alliance is for, not just what it is against. So there's a sense in the population, I think, that the alliance has operated, obviously, for the last 20 years against terrorism in the Middle East and the rise of extremism there. There's a sense that it is now directed against China, I think. And some people support that, some people see that as a concern. But there is a sense that what it is perhaps lacking is a positive articulation of what does success actually look like. And I think that goes to a broader issue of the extent to which the Australian or governments over the last decades probably, to what extent they have actually spoken to the Australian public about the alliance. I think it's an interesting observation to say that probably the most important speeches about the alliance given by Australian policy makers and politicians in recent years were given often more in Washington than in Australia. So I think a need to start articulating a positive view of the alliance to the Australian population is something that flows from a range of our research questions. And I think related to that is this issue that Andrew already said about activating a broader based alliance. Obviously, defense and security cooperation are at the core of the alliance, but defense and security are not necessarily the only and the dominant kind of concerns that Australians have about their future, about what's happening in the region. And there is a sense that the alliance is an incomplete project, I think, that there's just something missing, that we're not, on the one hand, not exploiting or not leveraging the alliance enough to actually addressing all those broader points, including in particular, I think, climate change, but also development disparities in our region, to the extent that we should, and to the extent that would ultimately be aligned with our interests. So broadening the alliance beyond the foreign and defense policy context, I think is a second kind of major kind of takeaway that we think you can draw from the consultations in this report.
And speaking to some more of these recommendations as well, perhaps Andrew, you can speak to that notion of sovereignty too.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So really, recommendations 3 and 4 were closely tied together in the sense that they did speak to sovereignty and the national interest. And I think certainly recommendation 3 was very much aware, sort of leveraging off a theme among respondents was that, right from full supporters through to opponents, a thread that really ran through that were concerns about sovereignty, and even supporters of the alliance were sort of aware of the need for this. This is a bit of a delicate balancing act for governments. On the one hand, Australia needs to demonstrate its fidelity to the United States in terms of that alliance relationship and support the US globally. On the other hand, governments need to demonstrate the value proposition for Australia in terms of the alliance enhancing our sovereignty, or at the very least, not compromising our sovereignty. And that's been a delicate balancing act throughout history if we go right. Well, if we really go right back to the 60s in the alliance. So really the key here is articulating how the alliance can enhance Australia's sovereign interests in the Indo-Pacific, but I think more generally internationally. And I guess the other point here is around national interest with recommendation 4. Returning to sort of the debate around, or the discussion, I should say, around values, and I think the general skepticism towards a values-led alliance among people we engaged, I think there was a view that, it's actually, if we think about it, it's quite a traditional Australian approach to the alliance, which is very pragmatic, utilitarian in its focus. What's in it for us as a smaller power? What can we get out of this alliance? So in that sense, maybe that finding wasn't too surprising given the history. But I think trying to sort of protect or indemnify the alliance against the rise of figures like Trump. So I think a lot of people were aware that we don't necessarily want to nail our colours to the mast of a leader like Trump, and so a shared values sort of discourse would sort of lock us into doing that. And so to avoid that, stepping back and really emphasising, certainly communicating to the Australian public in very clear terms why this country makes a decision in the national interest to have the alliance rather than vice versa. So I think that's really important, that the government has to be much more proactive in doing that.
And then bringing it closer to home, Caitlin, perhaps we could turn to you to speak to those last two recommendations.
Might help if I come off mute. Thanks so much, Scott. I think here, and this is picking up on a couple of the points that Andrew has made already, there is a real sense, I think, through the discussion that the participants in our conversations, were interested in Australia's engagement in our region closer to home. So we're talking here about Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. And, that the recommendation to emerge then is that as the government thinks about the alliance, really thinking about it through that lens of how it supports Australia's engagement in the region, it should be a primary focus. I think Australians that participated in these conversations, by and large, were not interested and not necessarily supportive of the alliance taking us further afield, but rather that we really need to think about how we better leverage aspects of the alliance to deepen our relationships in the region. There are some comms pieces here that need to be thought through more carefully. And again, Andrew's already alluded to that. So, and I think also the sense that Australian engagement in the region is part of our independent foreign policy. How we think about the alliance in that context also is important. Again, delicate balancing act comes to the fore here, because there are times, and I think this came through the conversations as well, where the alliance can offer an advantage for Australia in engagement, but there are also times where it might be, best put in the background of engagement. It doesn't always help to have the alliance first and foremost in the way that we engage. So I think some really careful calibration about the location of the alliance in our regional engagement is what's necessary here. The final recommendation, and this will probably be of no surprise, because I think what we've identified through this project is that it's important to have good consultation processes. And through good consultation, we're able to really get a much more nuanced understanding of what Australians are really thinking about certain issues in foreign and defence policy, the alliance being one of them. So we would suggest as a final recommendation that there should be greater consultation, particularly around the alliance, to understand what non-experts, so those outside the elites, the policy elite areas outside the Canberra bubble, actually do think about Australia's engagement with the US through the alliance. Now, I think here, and this is one that I find really fascinating, because it really speaks to the domestic dimension of public diplomacy and the role that a broad spectrum of agencies can play when it comes to public diplomacy in that domestic context. It doesn't necessarily mean that those views are going to drive the nature of the alliance, but they will inform policy perspectives, and they are important in terms of really understanding what can work, what will gain traction, what has support. It's also important to understand where are there points of contention or tension that really need to be understood more fully. So I think, in terms of how Australia looks forward at managing the alliance in a really strategically uncertain and volatile landscape, thinking then about the consultation piece should be on the government's radar and should be something that agencies are able to take forward in a much wider sense. One of the things I noticed was bringing more diverse audiences together, ensuring we had women in the consultations, younger voices as well as a whole range of other diverse voices, means that we do understand many more perspectives, and you can really start to think more carefully about the points of leverage going forward. So I think listening is an important skill, and it certainly relates to the alliance.
Thank you for teasing out, I think, the depth and the importance of Australians' views on the alliance. And on those recommendations, perhaps, Andrew, we could speak to you for some concluding remarks on the findings of this report.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Sort of further developing Caitlin's theme, the former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Peter Shergold, is sort of unrivaled in Australia in really examining, how policy development works, what doesn't work. And he's undertaken a significant number of reviews of particular programs. And, in 2016, he made the observation that good policy should harness the views of those who are impacted by that policy. And I think we can see that in areas like, tax reform, education, health, but puzzlingly, at least to me, and I think to the rest of the team, that really hasn't occurred very much or very often in the foreign policy and defence realms, which is still in some respects, I think, sort of hermetically sealed off from the public. Now, for some people, that's a good thing. It should be left to the experts. It's different. It's not a domestic issue. But I guess in our project, we took issue with that assumption for the reasons that Caitlin's just outlined, but also I think from a very, if I could say, instrumental perspective. So for supporters of the alliance, and I think it's fair to say that the alliance has strong bipartisan support among the governing parties in Australia for purely sort of pragmatic reasons, maintaining societal consensus around the need for the alliance is really critical to sustaining the alliance going forward, particularly when you have periods of disruption like Trump, when you have questions around, I guess US, the sort of the evolution of the United States domestically, whether democracy in that country is sustainable itself over the long term. I think, you need to, as a government, work very hard in Australia to preserve societal consensus that the alliance is a good thing and in Australia's national interests. And frankly, one of the key ways to do that is by undertaking regular consultation. Consultation doesn't mean gaining approval for specific initiatives. It just means taking on board what people are thinking and saying about the alliance. And, if this project can be another step in that direction, then I think the team, speaking on behalf of the team, would be really happy with that outcome.
And on those final comments, we'd love to thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation on an incomplete project, Australians' views of the US alliance. Thank you for being with us today.